So tonight's conversation, which ostensibly we were going to be talking about divination in Paul and the use of the Hellenic tradition in Paul's in the way that he determined himself to be an apostle. Upon listening to what we did last week, I think that we are going to have to do something quite different, and that is to complete what we were saying about Paul in a much more nuanced and I'm hoping a more fleshed out way. So that's what I want to start by saying. Okay, and with that, I am going to go pretty strongly on script. That way we can cover everything that we need to within the time frame that we have. And we may end up going a little bit over. So that's understandable. If you do have a question midpoint, just put it in the chat and then we'll try to look at everything at the end. So this is the second part of our discussion about Paul and Gnosticism. And we are going to look at some specific examples which indicate how Gnostic sources built on Paul's theology in a more detailed way, and show the specificities of which materials were most fecund for the followers of the Gnostic movement. After reviewing the first century resources, we will then go a few minutes to the Islamic reception of Paul, which I probably should have done my own entire series, an entire episode on this, but I think that we'll just leave it for the time being. So, and as with so many other things in my life, I begin with a quote from Blake. Both read the Bible day and night, but I read black where thou read white. I am going to argue that the Gnostic movements, which embraced the Pauline message, were indeed acute readers of Paul, pushing his concepts in radically different imagined ways. Though people borrowed, as then like they do today, from other movements when it suited, I would argue that Christian Gnosticism is primarily an inner church phenomenon, one that was interested in connecting the Christian revelation to the highest levels of being as related by Hellenic sources and Platonism. Paul had a similar aim, but without the Gnostic mythological structure, though it could be argued that he substituted his own, so to say. Fundamentally, I do not think that the Gnostic movement in Christendom would have been as popular or as influential were it not for the work and teachings of Paul. The Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon could complain that the Gnostics flourished throughout the empire. He wrote this in Against Heresies, the first book, by the year 180. And this speaks to the compatibility that many early Christians, especially those of the Pauline variety, would have found in early Gnosticism. To restate my position, these elements from the Pauline tradition, which gave rise to the same genre of thinking as early Gnosticism, if it is the same, but of course it must be said, and I'm going to go through each of these, that while Paul was not a Gnostic in the second or third century sense, his works would be fundamental for establishing these viewpoints. Said differently, he was not himself a Gnostic, but his writings made Gnosticism possible. But what from his writings? And I want to make this the case that I am using a linguistic comparative model to bring attention to these connections, meaning that was in the Pauline phrasing that many early Gnostic teachers found the seeds of their own theology. In a general sense, we will look at the specific framing momentarily. It can be boiled down to discourse surrounding these elements, namely election, whom is of the elect, what does it mean to be of the elect, initiation, those who are wise versus those who aren't, the power behind the cosmos, meaning the striations of spiritual governance, and there seems to be powers throughout the cosmos that strive against the power of God and oppose his church, which is very alien to a lot of particularly Pharisaic traditions, which we're going to talk a lot about why, that's going to be throughout this talk, is why we should not continue talking about Paul as a Pharisee. Finally, we have the notion of the true law of faith, meaning that there is an inner meaning of the law that has overcome the Hebrew law or the exoteric law revealed in the Hebrew Bible and its traditions. Mystery is another notion. So again, the notion that the world is a spiritually complex unity in which reality is concealed from most. And it brings to mind Heraclitus's dictum that nature loves to hide. I think you'd like that, Eric. And it requires a new gnosis or understanding to parse it. Finally, we have ascent. Paul speaks of himself as being caught up into the heavens in ascensionist, and this is very similar to ascensionist literature. which was very special to groups like the Sethians, and we will discuss that as well as my own work in Ascensionist research literature. And finally, we have the dualism of matter versus spirit, God versus the world, in opposition to the supremacy of the Jewish Lord of all. Where a good example of this is in the book of Job. Hast thou considered my servant Job? Where he's speaking to Satan. Paul has a much more dualistic identity of the world versus God's kingdom, and he presents this as two contradictory forces vying for dominance. And again, I think that's very alien to a lot of first century Jewish thinking, not so much in terms of demonology, but to the level of that. And you actually find this in Talmudic criticism, where it'll say Christians worship two gods, because Satan is essentially raised in a lot of Christian literature to the same degree as God himself. So it's quite problematic. And again, why I think it's best not to think about Paul in the terms of Pharisaism or in any normative Jewish sense from the first century. So, as we are doing a linguistic study, we have terms which are very salient to Gnosticism of the second and third century, but we're not going to talk about all of them today, but these are some that we should be aware of. So, the first we have the pleroma and the aeons. In Paul's letters, especially to Colossians and Ephesians, the term pleroma, meaning fullness, also appears. And this is a quote from Colossians 2:9. For in him the fullness, pleroma, of deity dwells in bodily form. It's very interesting. Gnostic used pleroma to denote the totality of the 30 aeons closest to the first principle. And Paul reclaims it using the same sort of, Paul declaims it by saying Christ himself is the divine pleroma, supreme and above all cosmic powers. And the way that usage is almost identical, it's just pushed in a very different mythological direction amongst Gnostic groups. And as I've said numerous times, when we talk about Gnosticism, we are not talking about one monolithic reality. We are talking about various groups with various different mythological structures, teachers, etc. But in order to say something about this sort of general, and I think they do share several things in common that are important to note, I think that this, is very much based on a very unique reading of Paul. And Gnostics would typically use pleroma to denote, as I've said, this totality of aeons, this realm of the divine in some cases, something that's very beyond the world, but yet something that a Gnostic should aspire to become part of. So we also have the term kelephale or kephale in Paul and many Gnostic, in much of Gnostic literature, particularly of the second century, but going well into the sixth. And kephale means head. And Paul's usage of Christ as the head of the church, creator and supreme, fullness, which he says in Ephesians and also in Colossians. And this was also incorporated into some Gnostic schools, with kephale referring to the primal man or the redeemer of all the cosmos, who is neither held to one particular body, but is in fact a continuation of several. So Paul repurposes this metaphor. Or more specifically, he presents it and then it is repurposed by the Gnostics, which is that the church should hold fast to Christ as head. And he actually says in Colossians that you shouldn't worship mediators. So this was the accusation against the Colossian church, that they were going to divine energies that were not God itself. And he's actually telling them. And this could be, I mean, it depends on how far you want to take this. Obviously, as we have no documents from the Colossian church itself, we don't know truthfully what their mythological ideas were. But it is similar that other Gnostic groups later, second and third century, would see this movement as the first actual sprouting of what they themselves were trying to do. So I do think that's interesting. However, for this discussion, much of what we're going to be talking about tonight is the distinction between hile, psyche, what it means to be a psychic, and a pneumatikoi. And those phrases you're going to get tired of hearing those in a few minutes, I'm sure. But before we do that, I think it's really good to look at which Gnosticisms Paul influenced And I didn't include the Mandaeans, who present themselves as a separate religion. I didn't include a lot of other groups. We certainly could have talked about more, but these are the groups that we that primarily cite Paul in their own lineage. So that's why I did this one. So we have the Marcionites. We have already met this with the with discussions about the formation of the Christian canon. They were a second century sect founded by Marcion of Sinope in Rome, who compiled a canon excluding the Old Testament and emphasizing exclusively, or not exclusively, but very highly the writings of Paul. And the central sort of text that, or the central idea that they had, was that the God of the Hebrew Bible is a malevolent demiurge, which comes from Platonic discourse, distinct from the holy benevolent God revealed by Jesus, leading them to reject entirely the Old Testament and any connection to the quote unquote Jewish God. Finally, we have the Basilidians. So these were also a second century Gnostic sect founded by Basiliades of Alexandria, and it was known for his exegetical commentaries and a very complex cosmology of 365 heavens ruled by the archons or principles. They upheld a docetic Christology. It's actually the first appearance of Docetism, meaning that Jesus only appeared. He did not have a physical body. He was not enmeshed in the world, but he appeared as such. And their ideas about crucifixion are kind of fascinating. And they're often associated with Simon of Cyrene as the person that was crucified instead of Jesus. So that's an interesting point. However, for our purposes, we will focus primarily on the Valentinian tradition and the Coptic Sethian tradition. Firstly, because I have relied heavily on Pagel's interpretation of the Valentinians, and I have conducted extensive personal research on this session on the Sethian Essentious narratives, two of which are currently, I'm dealing with right now, and they're under review. So that's why I'm specifically focusing on the Valentinians and the Sethians. So, who were the Valentinians? Valentinianism was one of the major Gnostic Christian movements founded by Valentinus, who lived between the year 100 and 165 in the mid-2nd century. His teachings spread widely across the Roman Empire from northwest Africa and Egypt through Asia Minor to Syria. Salvation in his idea comes through esoteric gnosis, or knowledge of one's divine spark amid a flawed material realm created by a lesser god, the demiurge. Clement of Alexandria records that Valentinus studied under Theodos, a companion of Paul, though this connection remains debated among scholars, and I'm actually more in favor of it than not. I think that that's probably true. However, it was a significant importance for how the Valentinians oriented themselves and understood their relationship with Paul, and that's often how in the literature you'll find it. We received this information from Paul himself through Theodos. And there's also a Theodotus, which we'll talk about very soon. So, with the same question, okay, we talked about Valentinians. Now let's talk about the Sethians. So, influential in the 2nd and 3rd century, this was a Gnostic movement which blended Hellenic Judaism and Middle Platonism, venerating Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, as the patriarch of a distinct spiritual race. So the Sethians emerged in the 2nd century as a distinctive Gnostic sect and flourished throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries and were first attested by writers like Irenaeus and Hippolytus. They centered on this figure of Seth, as I've said, the third son of Adam and Eve, as the progenitor of this new spiritual people. And they wove an elaborate cosmology of emanations, which they used the Pauline term aeon. It also has a Greek reference as well, so you can say that they were borrowing from Greek tradition. I would probably say it's a mixture of both. And this was a transcendent pleroma, a world that's completely separated from the material, with an ignorant demiurge whose material creation traps these sparks of the divine which were lost. And their surviving texts, most notably the Zostrianos and the Allogeneses, describe visionary ascent through successive realms of light, each guarded by secret names and hymns, reflecting a stark dualism between corrupt matter and the spiritual life. By the late 2nd century, Scythian communities had spread across Egypt, Palestine, and into Greater Armenia, leaving a rich legacy in the Nag Hammadi library and influencing later Gnostic traditions with their emphasis on gnosis as the soul's path from entrapment to reunion with the hidden spirit. The creator god, Yaldabaoth, is an ignorant archon, meaning governor, who imprisons sparks of divine light in matter. Liberation is achieved through secret knowledge, gnosis, and through the ascent through the realms of oppression. In Pagel's treatment of Valentinian Gnosticism, which I present as the larger part of my attention today, she draws primarily, and this is, I'm jumping around a lot, I realize there's so much to cover, but she draws primarily from the Valentinian tradition and these two thinkers. So we've gone through the Valentinians and the Sethians, those who we're talking about today. And now let's go back into the Valentinians as Pagels presents them, and that we can continue developing what some of their ideas were. And understanding that is very important to start with the fact that these writers, these traditions had their own writers and teachers. And that's who we introduce here. The first one is Heracleon or Heracleon. There's differing ways about presenting it. So he was a prominent figure within the Valentinian Gnostic school, and his teachings and writings significantly influenced early Christian thought, particularly in the realm of biblical exegesis. According to Origen, and his commentary on John, the second book, he was a disciple of Valentinus himself, and Clement of Alexandria also recognized him as the most famous representative of the Valentinian school in Italy. His major surviving work consists of 48 fragments of his exegesis on the Gospel of John, preserved in Origen's commentary on John. And he refers to this work, Origen refers to this work as hypomnemata, so commentary, that which is taken out. And from Origen, we also get this very telling statement, which I think is sort of, I included it because it's kind of funny. He says, Heracleon pays no attention to the history. So he says he's not interested in history. He's always in the pleroma. As Schaff translates it, meaning that his entire focus was on the interior of history and not on the exterior, and that was a source of a great deal of contention in the early church. In our section from Pagels, which I will read today, it comes a great deal from his thought, as well as his associate Theodotus. From the scant data available, Theodotus is known to, and this is a quote, by the way, all of this comes from Donninger's article. From the scant data available, Theodotus is known to have taught Gnostic doctrines in Asia Minor roughly around the same time, 160 to 170, elaborating on the principles of the early 2nd century. He was a Gnostic, and his teachings survive in this particular text, which is Excerpta ex Theodoto, and it's a scrapbook that comes from the 2nd to the 3rd century. And it was made by the philosophical theologian Clement of Alexandria, and it was appended to his Stromata or Miscellanies. Certain passages integrate the comments of Clement. Thus, it is unsystematic in its arrangement of the material, and this causes several issues of interpretation. The Gnosticism of Theodotus affirmed that the world is a product of a process of emanations or radiations from an ultimate principle of unconditioned being or eternal ideas. Intermediate beings in the hierarchy of perfection include God, the creator of matter, and Christ, the Redeemer, who united himself to the man Jesus at his baptism to bring men gnosis, and this is called an adoptionist theory in Christologies. Salvation, he concluded, is reserved for only the believers infused with the pneuma, or spirit. And as we've already seen, the terms haile, psyche, and pneumata are very important. So now, after already using them, it's important that I think we probably get some ideas about what I'm saying there precisely. So, in the Valentinian system, the tripartite division between hylic, psychic, and pneumatic is sharpened into a clear contrast between psychikoi, meaning those of soulish persuasion, and pneumatikoi. Hele and helic souls are those who are of the lowest level of incarnation, and they are called fleshly souls. So this is the sort of division we are dealing with. And this actually reflects an original ontological difference in human nature. It is that people are born with these traits. And this sort of ties, in a certain sense, to the sort of genetic descent narrative that the Sethians use. So, drawing on New Testament contrast, Jude 19, 1 Corinthians 2, 14 and 15, the psychikoi are those whose lives are governed by the soul, psyche, and who can attain salvation through faith, moral conversion, and adherence to religious practice. The pneumatikoi, by contrast, possess an innate divine spark, a pneuma, and are predestined by the aeons for direct esoteric knowledge, gnosis of the Father, transcending both material and soulish existence. The Valentinians used Paul's writings to articulate a significant theory of an ontic difference between the nature of the pneumatikoi and the elect versus those who would come to believe, or those who were cast out in the flesh, sin, the flesh, and the devils. Origen dealt seriously with Heraclion, who is the main source of a lot of this information, and I think that's very clearly evidenced by the fact that he includes 48 of his citations in his commentary on John. And he was addressing the viewpoints of the Gnostics was a central preoccupation for him. And to quote from his commentary on the Gospel of John, after he wrote this between 231 and 250, we find this comment. By the way, he was taken, he was abducted, so he wasn't able to write, to finish it. So he writes, Heraclian's view that the Lord brought life only to the spiritual. This is the refutation that he wrote. Heraclian adopts a somewhat violent course when he arrives at the passage, who was made in him was life. This is reference from the Gospel of John. Instead of the in him of the text, he understands it to mean, I'm adding that, to those men who are spiritual, as if he considered the logos and the spiritual to be identical, though this he does not plainly say. And then he proceeds to give, as it were, an account of the origin of matter, and says, he, the Logos, provided them with their first form as their birth, carrying further and making manifest what had been sown by another, into form and into illumination, and into an outline of its own. He did not observe how Paul speaks, and by the way, that's the subtext of that is that's coming directly from Paul. So, Origen refutes this by saying he did not observe how Paul speaks of the spiritual and how he refrains from saying that they are men. A natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, but the spiritual judgeth all things. That's another quote from Paul. We maintain that it was not without a meaning that he did not add the word men to the word spiritual. Spiritual is something better than man, for man receives his form either in soul or in body or in both together, not in what is more divine than these, namely in spirit. And that is after he has come to have a prevailing share of this that he is called spiritual. Moreover, in bringing forward such a hypothesis as this, meaning he being Heraclion, he furnishes not even the pretense of proof and shows himself unable to reach even a moderate degree of plausibility for his argument on the subject. A little spicy comment. So much then for him. So we have this, that they're essentially using many of the same words, they're using the same passages, and people are having vastly different reactions to what that means. And Origen is here also using a very maybe not directly Gnostically infused type of argumentation, but certainly that every word in the Bible carries immense interpretive significance. And he's saying, well, he didn't say men, so he's talking about something else. But I think that I picked this selection because I think it's really kind of a poor argument, really, in a lot of ways. And I do all of that to show that people were interested, not just Gnostics, but the entire Christian tradition was interested in understanding why they came to the positions they did and in refuting them. And yes, so now let's go and let's look at some of the portions that comes from Paul's writings itself that thinkers like Heraclian and Theodotus used to construct their interpretations. And I want to begin with Second Corinthians, 2:14 and 15. But the natural person does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for to him, this is the same quote that Origen gave earlier, they are foolishness, and he is not able to know them because they are pneumatikos, spiritually examined. But the pneumatikos, the spiritual ones, examine all things, yet he himself is examined by no ones. In the NRSV from the same chapter, they say, those who are unspiritual do not receive the gifts of God's Spirit, for they are foolishness to them, and they are unable to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. Those who are spiritual discern all things, and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny. The rhetorical questions on verse 16 likewise assumes that there is a deeper connection for those that are of the elect from those born of matter alone. And Paul uses Isaiah 40, verse 13, asking, for who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? So we find that he's trying to present these things by saying, oh, well, this is some kind of divine mystery. But we see that all the roots of an opinion like Heracleon's or Theodotus is found in these same texts. That's what I'm trying to get on. And as I've said, let's revisit this quote from Origen. Heracleon adopts a somewhat violent course when he arrives at the passage, what was made in him was life. Instead of the in him of the text, he understands to those men who are spiritual. Well, this seems to be the same thought that is being conveyed here. And he is not able to know them because they are spiritually examined. But the pneumatikoi have the ability to examine and yet are themselves not examined. And I hope you pick up how significant that was. And that Origen is trying to say that this is a misreading of Paul. However, it's not entirely. It's just a different reading of the same text in a different way. As if he considered the logos and the spiritual to be identical, though he does not plainly say, and then proceeds to give, as it were, an account of the origin of the matter, and says, he, the logos, provided them with their first form at their birth, caring further and making manifest what had been sown by another, into form and into illumination, and into an outline of its own. Though Origen says that Heracleon is misunderstanding the text of John, it is on the basis of a strongly Pauline understanding of what it meant to be pneumatical. So this kind of depiction that Gnostics are completely out of the realm and that there's no grounds for what they're saying and it's all mythology and all external things. No, they are acute readers of Paul the Apostle. And they are taking the principles that they're finding in him to radical conclusions and reapplying them to the text. So if Paul's talking about pneumatikoi in Corinthians, they're looking for pneumatikoi in John because it has to line up. Paul also seems to suggest that only the wise, that it is only to the wise, to the pneumatikoi, that he is called to be an apostle. And we are to understand this from his discussions in Romans chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. I do not wish you to be ignorant, brothers, that often I intended to return and come to you, and I was hindered until now. To the Greek and to the barbarian I am by no means subject, rather to every wise one, apostle, faithful teacher of the nations in faith, to every wise one. Origen is again trying to diminish this idea of destination or organic choice, but it's here, and this is where he's coming at it. And again, I'll keep hammering that home until we all get that. We see that he uses the notion of ignorance and wisdom also here. I do not wish you to be ignorant, reiterating that rather than to the Greek and to the barbarian, to those who are assumingly in ignorance, to whom he is not subject, rather he is subject to every wise one. Uniquely, it seems, he is an apostle to them and a faithful teacher of the nations. Valentinian's students interpreted this as a different form of human identity, ontic reality, and this is carried through in the Sethians. And I now wish to shift this attention slightly to the issue of election. So we've talked about the pneumatikoi and their opposition to the Helic people, who are the lowest, and these progressives that are the psychic, those who have the ability to be converted. So now let's talk about what that looks like in Paul's understanding and how the Gnostics also took that to be. So, and this is the sort of very much inclined with this notion of election and direction is also the notion that this multiplications of powers in the cosmos. And this is a modern Mithraic painting, and it's an image of Ion, who is a Mithraic deity, overcoming the enslavement in the helikos matter. And it shows the idea that unlike in Judaism, where God is the supreme source of all things, Paul incorporates ideas derived partially, it could be argued, from Persian dualistic thinking, which entered Judaism after the Babylonian exile in 597, and he has incorporated this into his entire cosmological image. This, not to belabor the point, is a standard element of Jewish apocalypticism and not distinctly of the Pharisaic tradition. We read. Now, all of this is going to come together, and I want you to understand election and these distinctions that he had, not as difference, but as something that he also worked through in his own soteriology. So this is 1 Corinthians 2, verse 6. Yet we speak wisdom among the teleos, meaning the elect, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age, the archons, the archons, who are passing away into nothing. Yet among the mature, the initiated, we do speak wisdom, though it is not wisdom of this age, nor the rulers of this age, who are doomed to perish. That's an additional translation. This one verse is layered with an entirely new cosmology, quite different from the older Jewish cosmology, and that one that borrowed greatly from popular Hellenic religion, from which Paul draws extensively, especially in his discussions of divination. Sorry again, next week all. And also from the Judaic apocalyptic tradition. So let's look at these terms. We have firstly teleos, when Paul says, yet we speak wisdom amongst the teleos. And where does this term originate? This has a long history in the Greek mystery traditions. In the Eleusinian traditions, in the Attic inscriptions at Eleusis, phrases like eos tos tilios or tos tilios mark regulations or dedications to the initiate. And we see these differences here. We have mueos, which literally means I enter or I initiate or to enter. And this in typical mystery cult religion is the first stage. Then we have the epoptes, which were individuals who were able to see. They were granted higher permissions in the cult. They could watch several traditions. And then finally we have the teleos, the truly perfected ones. And these were the ones who'd gone through each level of initiation. And we also find this in Orphic gold tablets, which are addressed to the soul as teleos, as the perfected soul. And this promises a post-mortem guidance, having reached the dwelling place of the perfected. Hotes es oskon epitelios. And we also find it in Dionysian and Samothracian context, literary references in Plutarch's Moralia. And this is a contrast between mystii, which Paul also uses, new initiates with teleos, those who've attained the highest level of initiation. We also see in Paul's work here, remember that we saw the term archon. So not of this age, nor the rulers archons of this age. This phrase bespeaks a highly complicated structure of other spiritual powers, which I would argue Paul is already aware of, as evidenced by Colossians. He uses this language because it is a reflection of his own spiritual worldview, and it represents a particular moment in the Near Eastern use of this term. Not the way it originally appeared as archon as city-state rulers. It's a very interesting point that it's gone from being a very specific political term to a religious term in double quick time, really. So it's very, very interesting. And the term has a long afterlife. It continues to be used by Gnostic movements well into the 6th century. In Gnostic systems, archon and archonates are rulers, and these are cosmic powers responsible for constructing and governing the material universe. They emerge from the actions of the Demiurge, an ignorant creator god, and they serve as his administrators. Their name reflects both the political authority and spiritual obstruction of what was a unique feature of Helleno-Judaic culture of the 1st century. Now, I'm trying to wrap up in this slide what I've tried to say here. And that is that the elect, it seems to be there is an origin, there is a push towards saying that there is something ontic happening on the level of election. That these are the receivers of wisdom and that they are somehow separate from the world as it is, from the hyle, from the creation of the world as it is. That there is this dualistic concepts, not only in the way Paul's viewing the world, but in the way Paul is viewing other people. And this is seized upon by Gnostic thinkers in really dramatic ways. And this is separate, and this is the second idea. So unlike in the traditional Judaic formulation where the world is God's creation and the place of God's celebration, we find a physical world completely or partially separated from the divine. And it is underscored, and this is underscored in Valentinian Gnosis. The only things worth knowing cannot be known from the world. And you have to be chosen, you have to be descended from these sparks of life in order to have any wisdom. It's also, by the way, remarkably similar to ideas that come from the Dionysian initiations, where Dionysus says, he was basically Zeus created the world out of the ashes of the Titans, representing the physical world, and Dionysus. And if you have a spark of Dionysus in your being, this is your call to eternal life. And I think all of that is in play in the way Paul's employing these terms. We've just forgotten a lot of the context that these came from. So that's my attempt to wrap up. The main topics I've covered, and heretofore to introduce our reading from Pagel's 1975 book of the same name of the presentation, The Gnostic Paul. In order to see how thinkers like Heraclian and Theodotus engaged with Paul's work, I quote from Pagel's summary of these articles found on pages 19 and 20 of her manuscript. Paul speaks, so this is from Pagel's 19. Paul speaks here to the Jew first, Romans 2:19, to those under the law, that is, to the psychic. He warns that every soul, that is, every psychic, will be requited according to his works. Heraclian offers a parallel exegesis of Romans 13:1, where Paul warns every soul that he is subject to higher powers. Above all, to him who bears the sword, in judgment to punish evildoers and to reward those who do good. Heraclian explains that the one who judges and avenges is Moses, that is, the lawgiver himself. The Demiurge, the creator of the physical world, he is the servant of God who executeth his wrath. That's the quote. By contrast, God the Father of Jesus, judges according to the truth, Romans 2:2, intending in his kindness to lead the psychics into repentance. And for justification, this is cited, Romans 2:12 through 16. All who have sinned without the law also perish without the law, and all who sin in the law shall be judged through the law. When the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature, physei, the things of the law, they themselves, not having the law, are the law for themselves. There's a lot of use of law there. But you're seeing there is an ontic difference. He's saying that there is a difference in people's realities. And if you want this, most clearly, he's literally saying that there is a separate way of dealing with people who are not of the tribe of Israel. Now, of course, Paul is very important he wants to do this because he's doing an alternative theology, but it's a very radical statement, and it should be held, I think, still as such. So they show that the effect of the law, to ergon ton nomo, is written on their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, accusing or defending them on the day when God judges the secrets of men according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you want to know something, then I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. For Heracleon, when Paul's talking about the Gentiles that are following the law on their own heart, he says, well, that's connected to the pneumatikoi, those whom you cannot judge. So it's a complete inversion of the categories that Paul is using in very dramatic ways. So while he being Paul, warns the psychic Jews who remain in the law that they face its judgment, Paul reveals that the pneumatic Gentiles do not stand under the Demiurge's law at all. Although they seem to be perishing in materiality, as Heracleon admits, they actually are exempt from the Demiurge's law and from his jurisdiction. Basiliades, offering a similar exegesis, explains that the Pneumatics delight in the law of God, of the Father, according to their inner anthropos, the inner man, of the Father of life, the living Father, not the creator of the world, the God of the Old Testament. And this is the nature of a pneumatic essence, to be without obligation to the law of the God of this world. And this is ultimately, if you feel called and you don't like this relationship, in Gnostic understanding, you were probably one of the psyche, or maybe the pneumatikoi, those who are willing to ascend, and not the false creation of a false deity. Yet their natural affinity with the Father is secret, hidden from psychics, and also from the Demiurge. This is the pneumatikoi. Their connection is known by no one else. Only their own conscience testifies to it. The secret shall be revealed only when God the Father judges the secrets of mankind. Paul declares, however, that God shall not judge, as the Demiurge does, through the law, but according to the gospel that he's providing. Now, that may sound quite radical, but that is in fact what you find. And again, it's very important to try to understand the scriptures in and of their bizarrity, really than trying to see them as coherent and basing on several thousand years or on 2,000 years of theological interpretation. They're much more complicated, I think, and interesting. But they shall be judged not through the law, but to the gospel which I have given them. If then the uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be accounted as circumcision? And the one by nature uncircumcised. So this is where Paul's saying, okay, well, on the inner level, if you accept these things, if you accept the gospel, this is counting as faith, and it's separating you from the God of this world. Now, I don't think that Paul believed anything like the way the Gnostics would have conceived this, but I think that his idea about the fallen nature of the world, completely fallen, which is an apocalyptic idea, really adds a lot to this separation. So who keeps the law? The law shall judge you, and through literalism and circumcision, one transgresses it, which is another complete inversion. You want to follow the law? Don't follow it, because it's the law of the God of this world. And you have to break yourself from that in order to ascend. This is the Gnostic reading of Paul's text. For it, he is not a real Jew, he who is outwardly circumcised, nor is his true circumcision external, it is in the flesh. But he is truly a Jew who is one in secret, his circumcision of the heart, pneumatic, not literal. And his praise is not from men, but from God. Paul explains here the deeper meaning of circumcision as the Jews, the circumcised, in the Valentinian idea, signify the psychics, those who are circumcised in the flesh. So the Gentiles, who are by nature uncircumcised, meaning not bound to the laws of this world, signify the pneumatic elect. This is the Valentinian reading. The pneumatics keep the precepts of the law far better than psychics, who are found to obey the demiurgic law. The inner natural law of the pneumatic nature, the law of God, is written on their hearts, not any law of human hands. That's also very common, which Paul himself uses. There's an inner law and an external one. I come to give you the law of Christ do not take the law of, do not be as those who backslide and go back and say you have to be circumcised. It's just a more radical interpretation of what that means. And the pneumatic is the one who is truly a Jew, which is also a really interesting thing, because a lot of these Gnostics would say, well, if you have this type of inner realization, well, you're the true tribe of Israel. Which, when you look at the history of Christianity, which continuously tries to submit the church for the Jewish nation, that has a certain logic that comes from Paul that is highly influential in Gnostic thinking. As Theodotus says, Israel is just an allegory of the pneumatic who sees God himself. So how can Paul, having censured the people that are the practicing Jews for judging the Gentiles, go on to approve the pneumatic Gentile, the one who is by nature uncircumcised, who keeps the law, 226, who judges the psychic Jew? So he's saying, well, the uncircumcised is judging the circumcised. It's a complete reversal again. The initiated reader, meaning those who share the Valentinian interpretation, could follow Paul's argument. For the psychic to judge the pneumatic is impossible, since no one can receive pneumatic things but they're given by God, 1 Corinthians 2:14. But Paul teaches, on the other hand, that the pneumatic judges all things, 1 Corinthians 2:15. Not only themselves, but even angels who belong to the psychic creation. So very, very complicated relation of how this works out. And according to the symbolic reading of the passage, meaning the passage that we just read in Romans, then Paul contradicts psychics whose self-understanding is that they are people who follow the law willingly, but they can never be those who are changed in the inward man. And although they boast on their reliance on the law of their relation to their God, the demiurge, and of that superiority to the Gentiles, he often talks about Jews feeling superior to the Gentiles. He said this in 2:17-20. Now they're shown to be far inferior in Paul's logic, because the new revelation has come. Anyone who holds to the old one has been lost. So, and then this is all of that to end, and I realize I do feel sorry for those of you who are. It is a lot to go. It's a lot to go through, but you're here anyway, so very good. So to end all of this, he says in Romans 3:1-2, what advantage then has the Jew? What is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. First, that they are entrusted with the pronouncements of God. He at the very end, so he has to go by and he has to try to win all these things. Gnostics just go one step further and saying that what he's saying here is true about everything, and that we can go a little bit deeper in all of these things. And again, I think this is inside the house of Christianity. I don't think that the majority of this is coming from out. And I think that's really, really interesting, because this is not how we think about Gnosticism very often. And we don't think about Paul as a Gnostic. But as anybody who's sat through this seminar so far, we know that there is a strong difference about, that is our preeminent question that we've asked throughout the seminar. Why is it that Paul's voice is the dominant one for the Christian church? It's not an easy answer. We see here the ingenuity of Paul's Valentinian interpreters and the way that they often use their exegetical method to interpret Paul in works that may have transcended his original intention. I think they did, but were not antithetical. They didn't change so much. They just pushed it in new ways. And with that, and I would love to talk more. I know it's very difficult constructs, because I'm reading all these things. If you're not familiar with them, if you're not sharing my mind, I realize it can be a little bit. But you can look at these. I'm happy to send the script as well. So if anybody wants to go through it, I'll make it available on my academia.edu page, and or we'll put it on the library, and you can do it. So with that, I have to leave the Valentinians, unfortunately. Now let's go back to the Sethians. This is an image here of Seth. This is from Armenia. So Sethian Gnosticism emerged in the 2nd century AD in Egypt and Palestine. And it's very important to remember those contexts. fusing a Jewish Barbeloite, which is a particular term, Barbelos, a Coptic term, which has very long history in Coptic religion, Coptic Gnosticism. And this was essentially a baptizing group, as the Mandaeans were, as John the Baptist were, as several Pharisaic groups were also baptizing. And they combined this with this sort of basic early form of the Hermetica, astrological ideas, and Middle Platonic ideas, mostly through the Ptolemaic period's inception there. Adherents revered Seth as the spiritual progenitor, as I've said, of a perfect race, whose descendants had forgotten their true nature. The Sethian cosmology, therefore, might be thought of as constituting the following points. Oh, I should put this on. No, did I not? Oh, sorry. The pleroma is the fullness of the divine aeons emanating from the unknown God. It's the spiritual realm at which all beings seek to enter, because it is the only point at which, and by the way, it's the lowest point in their cosmology, because it's just above the reach of the archons of this world. And there's even this beautiful line, which is, "And what shall we know after the pleroma?" Which I think for a lot of Swedenborgians we can relate to. It's kind of happily. So then we have the Sophia figure, which we haven't really discussed. I'm hoping most of you know who that is. So Sophia, the divine essence, the divine image sometimes. She gives birth to Yaldabaoth, the creator of the physical world, and the 7 archons that he initiates that start the creation of material realm. And these archons imprison the sparks of light that lie within the physical bodies to obstruct their return to the realm of their father. She is supposed to be, Sophia is translated as wisdom. But there's an entire concept that we... And I would say, why is she called wisdom? Who has given her such a title? Should we to sit and wonder at her actions? So, okay, and I have to add this, my own thing here. In my own work, I've focused on how Sethian ideas influence the Gez scriptural tradition of Ethiopia, primarily in comparing motifs from the Apocalypse of Adam, which is a Sethian Nag Hammadi tractate, with those in the Ethiopian First Enoch tradition. That's my own contribution, if I have anything to this discussion, which is how these ideas spread. Of particular interest to the Sethians was the process of the liberation of the souls from the body through baptism, and the process of cosmic ascension outside the physical world to return to the pleroma. Sethians argued with Paul in Ephesians, where the apostle says, "For I agree," sorry, I didn't mean to say argue, I meant to say agree, with Paul when he says in Ephesians, "Our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." New Revised Standard Version. So this was not, I did most of the translations for this session. I did not do this one. This one's unbelievably accurate. Their process of redemption involved both an acknowledgement of the true Lord beyond this world and of the Lord of this world, and they distinguish them, but also their attempt to flout this God of the world in redemption. Baptism and through the heavenly ascent was the way that you overcome the God of this world. And as we see here, the secondary baptism, and this, by the way, is, if you're not familiar with the term secondary baptism, this comes from the Gospels. So Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, but then there is the second baptism, which he tells people, "Go forth into all the world, make ye disciples." So there are 2 baptisms generally. There's actually 3, and I can't really remember the third, where the third comes from. And I'm hoping I'm not saying the second's the third, because I have a suspicion that I'm saying the second's the third. But we'll leave that. So go through baptism and ascend through the worlds. And we read in the Zostarianos, this, by the way, just to say a few words about what Zostarianos is, it's a mid-second century Gnostic text that was found in the Nag Hammadi areas, and it's Codex 8 of the Nag Hammadi scriptures. It was composed originally in probably Greek, and then it made its way into Coptic, and it's in the Coptic version somewhere around the 4th century that we have it. And it recounts several themes, very important themes. Visionary ascent is a really big one through 7 aeons. And then we have 6 baptisms and the reception of the aeonic knowledge from divine beings. Now, this is Seba's translation. This is not the best one, but this was the one that I could find on the internet and could copy and paste. And it's good enough for what we need it for. We don't have to go through each of this. It's a very badly preserved manuscript. There are many gaps in it, but I want you to focus on this emboldened text. It is in the water of blessedness, which belongs to knowledge, that you will be baptized into the protophanes. It is in the water of existence, which belongs to the divinity, the kalyptos. Now, what I was trying to get at this particular injunction is that automatically within the notion of baptism itself, which very much was an issue in the 17th century, in the 16th century in the Reformation, but the notion about what is baptism is an incredibly important discussion. And we see here that from the very earliest days, basically 100 years since the death of Jesus, the origin of Paul's writings, we have incredibly highly symbolic interpretations about what it means, as well as a cosmology to follow through with those. And I just want to connect this again to my own research a little bit. It's not going to take very long. And it's interesting that in the Gez tradition, in a 6th century magical manual, which was developed it was dedicated to the revelation of Enoch and how you can use these for personal benefits. If any of you are interested, I'm working on a translation. It uses this phrase: to know the way of nature, one must drink in the waters of existence owned by Chaitipos. Chaitipos, Kalyptos. Seeing what I'm going here? And then I decided to include the, I need to get more comfortable with reading Gez out loud, so I'm going to try it. Mini gadotat teferet ro lemerdat, wiseo humenor, metalef, zazarechba, kaitipos zata, sari arwa. And by the way, this phrase, zata saiwa, the hidden one, is a direct translation of the Coptic, kalyptos. So they say haitopos, the hidden one. So this is my argument for why this tradition survived much later than we think. Even the unending travels in the astral world, however, were also connected to Paul's own works. Sethian initiates, which refer to themselves as the immovable race of Seth, underwent spiritual practices, baptisms, hymns, and silent epoteia, so, seeking revelations, to awaken inner spark of Barbelo's light, the light of the infinite. In texts like the Zostrianos, the Allogenes, and the 3 steles of Seth, the adept ascends across these aeons, the 7, and finds ritual empowerments along the way, culminating in the union with Barbelo or the unknowable Father. This ascent bestows gnosis that breaks the material bonds and allows the soul to return to the pleroma. Now, the accusation that this is a non-Christian idea is countered by Paul's own statement in 2 Corinthians. And I think this is NRSV. I didn't translate this one either. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. With this, and I know it has been both short and long, we're going to have to leave the Sethian tradition for our criminally quick time to discuss Paul in the Islamic tradition. By the way, this little thing right here, you see Paul, he's looking all confused. This is based on Islamic interpretations about who Paul was. And I asked Copilot, I said, can you create a Iranian miniature style of Paul looking confused and bewildered? So that was the idea. So Paul was a major thinker in the Near East, and his presence could already be felt by the appearance of the Rashidun Caliphate. El Khalifa Rashida, the era of the rightly guided caliphs, which is between 632 and 661, and this would have been the Prophet Muhammad and his direct disciples, or the people that led in this very early, before the establishment of the alternative caliphates. As such, Paul was also an important image or figure, and the followers of Islam wanted to understand, and he was important in their own polemics against Christianity. So this is all of this information that I'm getting here really comes from Mark. Is his name Mark? No, Michael Kuhn. And he's discussed this in terms of Paul's relation to a series of very early Islamic scripts related to distortion. And it's the narrative of distortion, or the narrative of tahrif. Tahrif being distortion. So in these narratives, Paul is depicted as causing discord amongst Christians, steering them away from righteousness and sowing division amongst different Christian sects. The believer in the narrative is portrayed as safeguarding the original religion of Christ, which was supposed to be proto-Islam, contrasting starkly with Paul's actions, who intended to deceive and lead astray. Paul's aesthetic lifestyle and visionary experiences are highlighted in a negative light. The Sethians and the Valentinians said, oh, look at his revelations. To early Muslims, this was a negative thing. And they believe he came under the influence of negative jinn, demons, those who obstruct. The believer's commitment to monotheism and the rejection of Paul's deceitful teachings echo Islamic principles of tawhid, emphasizing the contrast between the two characters, that you have the true revelations and the false revelations. And there's a particular surah where, it's a hadith where God talks about in the last days the true from the faithful. It's a very common Near Eastern phrase. And Paul is associated with this. Bulus is the name in Arabic. The text briefly mentions the Christian scriptures, stemming from Christ's teachings rather than Paul's writings, saying that they had been distorted and that these were actually very early aligned with Quranic narratives and tasfir, meaning hadith literature. So this is his element in distortion. Let's look at particular interpretations of Paul himself. So Bulus, there's also a Yunus, which is another thing. Bulus is the most common one in hadith literature. So he devises a plan to deceive Christians by simulating repentance, introducing doubt to their faith, and to lead them to hell. That's his goal. To demonstrate his repentance, he performs in symbolic acts like killing his war steed and covering himself with dirt. That's a particular story about Paul, that he was supposedly a Roman. He was a Roman official who was sent by the Romans to confuse the early Jews. So he lives in a church for a year after he does this, immersing himself in the study of the gospel to complete his acts of deception. And he has a vision which confirms his repentance. And he has this before he heads to Rome, and he wants everyone to know that he had this divine calling. He teaches others these distorted beliefs. He asserts that the Trinity consists of Christ, his mother, and God. This, by the way, is a Gnostic heresy that did exist, because it's thought that the mother was united with Mary. Sophia was Mary, the mother of Jesus. But it's not quite as dramatic as it's being implied here. And actually, I would say it's probably quite wrong. But this is an Arabic Gnosticism that was well enough remembered that they could talk about this. So he tells his disciple Malcolm, Paul tells his disciple Malcolm that Jesus was and is God, leading to the rise of three distinct Christological interpretations. And it's really funny that one of the accusations against Paul is that he produces three Christologies, and that confuses everybody. So it's an interesting thing. So they do acknowledge that he was probably martyred, but they see it as a way of him to, he has this evil intent of causing this discord, so he willingly gives his life for this. And there's several interpretations about what that meant. Some people actually call him a demon. And finally, the disciples of Paul propagate their distinct doctrines, and this leads to ongoing conflicts and schisms amongst Christian sects today. It should also be noted that really in Islam is the preservation of this idea of pure Judaism versus the obstruction of the apocalyptic. And that notion, that distinction really lives in Muslim identity. And it was a very big source of their polemics.